The Galactic Empire announced its triumph with banners stretched across the skies of conquered worlds, and the drums of war echoing through endless corridors of steel and fire. The propaganda machine roared that order had been restored and rebellion, crushed but hidden beneath the booming voices of victory, lay the truth that the Empire had executed 2 female generals who were not simply soldiers. They were icons, they were flames that refused to be extinguished, they had become symbols of resistance. Across dozens of star systems, the execution was not swift nor silent. The Empire broadcast the event to prove its strength to every citizen who dared. Questioned the throne across every planetary hub, every space station and every colony. Screen flickered to live showing the faces of the generals, standing tall, even as chains bound their wrists. The Empire expected fear, but what it received was something else. The women stood proud, their eyes unwavering. As they faced their fate, they carried themselves with dignity, a defiance that could not be crushed by blades or blasters. When the moment came and the executioner struck, silence fell upon millions of viewers across the galaxy. Yet that silence was not surrender. It was grief. It was anger. It was the heavy quiet of people who felt the fire of vengeance kindling in their chests. The Empire claimed this silence as obedience. But in the hearts of the people a seed had been planted, a seed that would grow into rebellion, far stronger than the Empire imagined. These generals had led armies not because they sought glory, but because they believed in something greater. They had fought on the front lines, not hidden in shadows. Their names had become songs sung by soldiers before battle. Their strategies had turned defeats into victories, and their courage had inspired even the hopeless colonies to rise when the Empire executed them. It did not kill only 2 women. It tried to extinguish an idea, but ideas are not so easily destroyed. Generals' last words were not cries for mercy. They were vows, promises that their deaths would not end the fight. They declared that the stars themselves would rise against tyranny, that the Empire would one day face justice. The soldiers who guarded them trembled, for even in death, these women were stronger than the Empire allowed itself to believe on. So when the Empire paraded their deaths as trophies across the cosmos, it thought it had secured peace. It thought the galaxy would finally bend under its iron rule. But what the rulers of the Empire did not know, what they could not comprehend, was that the generals were bound by blood and loyalty to men whose very names carried terror older than the Empire itself. The Empire had killed heroes, but in doing so it had awakened nightmares. Legends whispered in dark corners of both Earth and the stars, men whose wrath would turn silence into screams, men who would bring war back to the very heart of the Empire. Crowds filled the plazas and streets of the Empire, their faces lifted to massive screens that covered the towers of steel and glass. The voice of the Empire roared through speakers, declaring order restored, declaring enemies defeated, declaring that peace had finally returned. Yet beneath the rehearsed cheers and forced applause, something else was stirring within the people. Whispers passed from mouth to mouth like sparks leaping across dry wood. Whispers that the 2 generals who had fallen were not ordinary warriors, and that their absence would not bring peace but a stung. The silence after the executions still lingered, heavy like a weight pressing down upon entire star systems. Though the Empire tried to twist it into proof of obedience, in truth the silence carried grief and rage, the kind of rage that grows quietly until it can no longer be contained. In the mining colonies, men and women who had seen the broadcasts stopped their machines and lowered their heads in mourning. On the frontier worlds, veterans of the resistance sharpened their weapons, knowing they would soon have reason to raise them. Again, the generals had been more than commanders. They had been lights in the darkness, guiding those who believed the Empire could never be challenged. They had led from the front, unafraid of battle and unafraid of sacrifice. Soldiers followed them not for wealth or glory, but because they believed in their cause. Their victories had become legend, their speeches had become scripture to the oppressed, and their deaths did not erase that power. It magnified it and spread it across the galaxy like fire on planets close to the imperial core. The Empire worked hard to suppress unrest. Stormtroopers patrolled the streets, forcing citizens to shout praise for the Emperor, but the cheers were hollow and empty behind closed doors. Families whispered the names of the fallen generals. Like prayers, they knew the Empire had won only a temporary triumph, for something darker and stronger was on the horizon. For deep within the void of space, among the shadows of forgotten worlds, rumors began to surface that the generals were not only warriors, they were wives, and their husbands were not men of ordinary measure. The Empire had drawn blood from 2 women who shared their lives with beings far more terrifying than armies, far more unstoppable than fleets. The Whispers grew wilder. Some called one of the husbands Baba Yaga, a figure from ancient earth myth who walked like a ghost across battlefields. Some said he had been seen once in the ruins of a war, long forgotten, leaving behind no survivors. Others called the second the American Boogeyman, a hunter of men, a shadow that crept into nightmares and turned fear into flesh. The people spoke these names with awe and dread, for even if the tales were exaggerated, they carried a truth that chilled the blood. And so across the galaxy the Empire celebrated its hollow victory, while unaware that every cheer, forced from trembling lips, and every banner raised in false triumph, only drew the attention of two men who would not forgive, who would not forget, who would bring retribution greater than the Empire had ever faced. The Empire stood proud in its marble halls and steel fortresses, convinced that the deaths of the generals had secured obedience across the stars. But hidden beneath the surface of its celebration, there was a truth the rulers could not see. The Empire had unknowingly provoked two men whose very existence was wrapped in shadows, and whose names traveled further than the reach of imperial fleets. These men were not politicians nor soldiers bound by rank. They were nightmares clothed in flesh, and their wrath was boundless. Few dared to speak their names aloud, for fear that even the sound of those syllables might draw attention. Legends whispered across cantinas, in outer rim colonies, spoke of the one called Baba Yaga, whose figure drifted between reality and myth. Some swore he was not a man at all, but a spirit of vengeance that walked when called by blood. Others claimed he had once been mortal, but had crossed death itself and returned carrying with him an aura that made the bravest warrior falter. The other name carried its own terror, in a different form: the American Boogeyman, spoken in hushed tones by mercenaries and bounty hunters who claimed he had stalked them across planets and left them broken behind him. Unlike Baba Yaga, whose presence carried a supernatural dread, the Boogeyman was flesh and blood, yet he was no less fearsome, a man of unrelenting skill, forged in the fires of violence with the patience of a predator and the relentlessness of a These two were bound not by fate but by blood ties to the generals whose lives had been taken from them. Their wives had stood tall in defiance of the Empire, and now that their lives were extinguished, the fire passed to their husbands, who would not rest until the galaxy burned with their vengeance. In the quiet corners of space, smugglers whispered the tale of what was coming. Frightened refugees spoke to each other in the dark about the storm that approached. Even the Empire's own spies caught fragments of conversations, hints of names spoken in dread, though they dared not carry the full truth back to their masters for fear of being connected to the legends themselves. The Empire carried on its charade of power, tightening its grip with patrols and propaganda, yet the more it claimed victory, the more the people doubted, for everyone who had known the generals knew their husbands would not remain silent. Their names carried weight, heavier than fleets and stronger than blasters. Their rage was a force older than the Empire, and far more unstoppable. The galaxy had seen tyrants rise and fall, it had seen rebellions crushed and reignited, but never before had it faced the kind of reckoning that was now stirring in the shadows. It was not an army that the Empire had provoked. It was not a fleet, nor a rebellion. It was two men who carried in their hearts the wrath of legends, and in their hands the power to make myth into reality. The generals were gone, but in their absence, something greater was born, a storm that no walls could contain, no fleet could withstand, no emperor could silence. The Empire had killed heroes, and in doing so had summoned nightmares, and now those nightmares were awake. The first name whispered among frightened soldiers and desperate smugglers was Baba Yaga, a name that carried the chill of old earth forests where shadows stretched like claws and fires flickered against twisted trees. Though the Empire spanned countless systems across the galaxy, this name refused to vanish from memory. It clung to the bones of humanity like a curse, and every time it was spoken, voices lowered as though the man himself might be listening from the dark. Baba Yaga was said to be a man, but not entirely human anymore. Some said he had been broken in war, torn apart and reforged in silence until death no longer recognized him. Others said he had bargained with spirits beyond the stars, returning with eyes that glowed like embers and a soul stripped of mercy. What all stories agreed upon was that when he came for you, there was no escape. His steps were silent, his strikes were final, and the ground itself seemed to recoil from his presence in the outer colonies. Tales told of an entire battalion that had vanished overnight, no battle reports, no survivors, only scorched earth and silence. The mark of Baba Yaga was unmistakable devastation. Without explanation, soldiers who had once served under him spoke of a commander who never slept, who carried within his gaze the weight of every life taken and every loss endured. He fought not for victory but for inevitability. And when his wife the general was taken from him, the inevitability turned into destiny. Were warned by fearful parents never to wander into the dark, for Baba Yaga walked there waiting to take those who strayed, but mercenaries knew the truth. He did not hunt the innocent, he hunted the guilty, and in the eyes of Baba Yaga the Empire was the guiltiest force the galaxy had ever known. Gross cantinas on backwater worlds, men swore they had glimpsed him, a tall figure, wrapped in shadows with weapons gleaming like the teeth of a predator. His voice was rare, but when it was heard, it carried no hesitation, no mercy, no pause. He was a storm compressed into flesh, and when unleashed, there would be no shelter, no sanctuary, no escape. Empire laughed at myths, for its rulers trusted only fleets and blasters, but even among its high command there were those who had heard the stories and felt unease. They remembered the massacre on Durlus 9, where an entire Imperial squad had been found. Without a sound of struggle, weapons still in their hands, expressions frozen in terror, they remembered, and they whispered, though never in the presence of their emperor, that perhaps Baba Yaga was real. Alpha. Those who had seen him, there was no doubt he was real. He was more real than the Empire itself, and far more relentless. And now, with the death of his wife, his rage was no longer contained by shadows. He would not be satisfied with battles or assassinations. He would wage war on the Empire itself, and his war would not end until there was nothing left but ashes. The Empire had killed a general, but in truth it had summoned a legend, a force that had waited in silence for a reason to awaken, and now that reason burned brighter than any star. Baba Yaga was coming, and the galaxy trembled with every whispered retelling of his name. The second name that spread like wildfire across the galaxy was the American Boogeyman, and though the Empire dismissed it as the invention of fearful deserters, the truth lingered in every shadow, where soldiers whispered and mercenaries drank. Away there, dread his name was not born of myth but of blood, and those who had crossed his path carried scars both visible and buried deep within their minds. He was flesh and bone, yet he moved with the certainty of death itself. Long before the Empire stretched across the stars, he was already a legend, whispered among crime syndicates and military archives. His reputation was that of a relentless predator who never stopped once he had marked his prey. Stories told of men who fled across planets, changing names, changing faces, hiding in the deepest corners of the galaxy, yet still they were found by him, and when he found them, the end came swiftly, and without mercy. Unlike Baba Yaga, who carried with him an aura of the supernatural, the American Boogeyman was terrifying because he was real, utterly and undeniably real. He did not appear in the night through ancient rituals. He did not move like a ghost. He came like a man, but a man honed to perfection. Every strike precise, every movement calculated, his body a weapon, his mind sharper than any blade, and his patience endless. He would wait, he would hunt, he would finish bounty. Hunters spoke of him with reluctant respect. One told the story of how 3 of the most feared killers in the galaxy had been hired to eliminate him. They had prepared every trap, every ambush, every weapon they could muster. Yet when dawn came, their bodies were found in silence, their weapons untouched, their eyes wide with fear. The hunter who told the story had refused to even speak the details for fear that saying too much would invite the Boogeyman into his own life. The Empire thought itself untouchable, protected by fleets of destroyers and legions of soldiers, yet the Boogeyman thrived on impossibility. Every obstacle was only a delay, every fortress only another path to break through. There was no safety from him. Because he understood fear, he knew how to let it fester, how to let it gnaw at the hearts of men until they broke from within before he ever struck. When the Empire executed his wife, the general, they believed her death would silence resistance. Instead, it gave him purpose. For the first time, his fury was no longer for contracts or vendettas. It was personal. It was personal. It was bound to blood and love and loss, and nothing in the galaxy was more dangerous than a man who had lost everything but his rage. In taverns and barracks across the stars, soldiers swore they could feel him coming, even when no message or sighting confirmed. Its shadows seemed darker, silence seemed heavier, footsteps echoed in their dreams, and they woke with the certainty that the Boogeyman was near. His legend was no longer confined to stories whispered by criminals. It was spreading through the ranks of the Empire itself, poisoning morale and breaking resolve before he even appeared. The Empire could deny the supernatural nature of Baba Yaga. They could scoff at myths and dismiss them as peasant tales, But the American Boogeyman was undeniable, because he was human, and if one man could carve through armies with nothing but his will and his skill, then there was no safety in numbers, no comfort in ranks, no protection in fleets, and now that man was coming for them. The Empire had killed his wife and in doing so had unleashed the predator upon them, a predator that would never stop until every shadow of the predator was consumed by fear, and every leader who had signed her death faced him face to face in the silence of their final breath. When the news of the executions reached the two men, the galaxy seemed to pause as if every star held its breath. Baba Yaga heard first in the silence of a forgotten world where he lived among ruins like a shadow waiting for a purpose. The message came not through words, but through the trembling of the people who dared to carry it to him, and when he heard it he did not scream, he did not weep, he only rose, his eyes burning like coals in the dark. The American Boogeyman learned in a place far from the Empire, a place where he had been working in silence, carving his existence in the shadows. He received the report through channels meant for soldiers and spies, and when he read it, the world around him grew still, his hands clenched not in grief but in resolve. His wife had been taken from him, and now there was only one path left, a path soaked in vengeance, a path where no one would survive who stood in his way. The two men did not need to speak to one another to know what must be done. Across the void of space they moved, one from the east of myth, one from the west of blood, their wrath guiding them like a beacon each step. They took left silence behind every outpost that had sworn loyalty to the Empire suddenly found its walls cracked, its soldiers vanished, and its commanders left cold upon the ground. Baba Yaga moved like a storm made of whispers. He appeared where no path existed, entering imperial strongholds as if walls and blocks were illusions. His enemies never heard him coming, never saw him leave. Only the aftermath remained, a silence too heavy to bear, corpses arranged like grim warnings. His legend spreading further with every strike. The American Boogeyman was different. He did not vanish into myth. He came with the force of a hunter. His strikes were direct, his methods precise. He walked into enemy camps, and when he walked out, nothing remained. He left no confusion, no riddles, only the undeniable proof that he had been there, and that no one had survived. His cold, relentless efficiency was a terror even to those who had never seen his face together. Though apart, their wrath spread like fire across the Empire. Soldiers who once raised banners now trembled at patrol routes. Commanders who once barked orders now whispered in fear. Entire fleets paused their campaigns, unwilling to move, until certain that the two nightmares were far away. But the truth was, there was no far enough for Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman. They were coming closer. With each breath, each silent step, each calculated strike, the Galaxy watched with awe and fear. Colonies cheered in secret cantinas, sang songs in hushed voices. Slaves prayed in silence, all knowing that vengeance was awake. The Empire had murdered heroes, but in doing so it had created something far worse than rebellion. It had created a hunt, and the hunters were men who never stopped. The Empire still boasted of its power on official channels, but even the Emperor himself began to feel unease in the silence of his throne room, for, though he ruled fleets and armies, he knew deep in his heart that two men without armies, without fleets, and without mercy were moving ever closer to his gates. The Empire did not remain blind forever. It could not ignore the trail of silence and ruin that followed Baba Yaga and the American Boogeyman across the stars. So it sent its best soldiers, its elite legions, trained from birth in the arts of war, armed with the finest weapons of the imperial arsenal. They were told that they were invincible, that no man could break their ranks. They marched with pride, believing themselves the hand of the Emperor, yet they marched toward a fate that no training could prepare them for. First strike came on the desert world of Coltrus, where an imperial garrison of 500 waited in fortified towers, watching the dunes for any sign of movement. The officers assured their men that no shadow could cross the sands without being seen. Yet in the night the wind carried whispers, and then silence. By dawn the towers stood empty. The soldiers lay scattered across the sand, their weapons untouched, their eyes staring into the void. Every one of them struck down without a single alarm raised. Only one phrase was carved into the steel of the command tower, a phrase that chilled the survivors who discovered it later. She was my wife. Baba Yaga moved like the wind, invisible, inevitable. The elite soldiers never heard his steps, never caught sight of his figure until it was too late. Those who faced him swore that his gaze alone shattered their courage. His strikes came swift, as if the darkness itself obeyed his will. When Coltrus fell, the Empire called A coincidence, a failure of command, but deep down the truth was known. A nightmare had walked among them. The American Boogeyman made his move on the frozen moons of Ordran, where another elite detachment had been stationed over 300 strong. The Empire had placed them there as a demonstration of force to keep the mining colonies obedient. They expected rebellion from workers, not from one man, yet in the span of a single night the camp became a graveyard, the walls broken, the barracks silent. No alarm was sounded, no distress call sent. The Boogeyman had entered with precision, and left nothing but silence behind him. Like Baba Yaga, he did not vanish into myth. His work was direct, cold, unrelenting. Bodies lay exactly where they had stood in formation, each strike measured, each kill precise. No chaos, only order, the kind of order that comes when death itself is the commander. Carved into the frozen ice near the gates of the camp were the words, "She was my wife." The Empire began to understand that these were not isolated incidents. They were a war fought not by armies but by two men who refused to yield. Fear spread through the ranks. The elite legions, once so proud, began to falter at the mention of the names. Soldiers looked over their shoulders. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline, yet discipline could not erase the terror of knowing that no fortress, no garrison, and no legion was safe across the galaxy. The legend grew with every failed defense, with every destroyed detachment. Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman were not merely striking, they were dismantling the illusion of imperial invincibility, piece by piece, silence by silence, death by death. And the Empire, though vast and mighty, began to tremble like prey that finally senses the predator closing in. The galaxy was vast and divided, but news traveled faster than fleets, and rumors moved quicker than light. Every system that once whispered in secret now spoke openly of the two men who hunted the Empire, and with every fallen garrison their legend grew stronger. Entire colonies that had bowed to imperial power began to raise their heads for the first time in generations, for they believed that perhaps the Empire was not untouchable, perhaps its walls could crack and its thrones could fall. Frontier worlds where miners had long lived under the weight of oppression, men and women lifted their tools, not in labor but in defiance. They painted the names Baba Yaga and Boogeyman on their walls as a promise of vengeance. In the trade hubs, smugglers who once feared imperial patrols began to arm themselves boldly, knowing the Empire was stretched thin by terror. In the outer rim, slave camps fell into chaos as whispers turned into songs of rebellion, for the slaves believed that too avengers walked the stars and that freedom was near. The Empire tried to silence this storm with propaganda declaring Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman nothing but myths spread by cowards, but the people had seen the evidence themselves. Garrisons destroyed without a sound, fortresses broken without a battle, fleets turning up empty with no survivors. Soldiers told to remain strong felt their knees weaken at every rumor. They began to fear patrol duty. They began to question their commanders' discipline. Cracked under the weight of legend, in the Senate chambers of imperial governors, arguments broke out. Some demanded harsher control, others begged for diplomacy. But no voice carried more power than fear itself. Governors who had once sworn loyalty now considered retreat. Generals who had once enforced order now drank in silence, whispering that the Empire had awakened something beyond its control. Merchants carried stories along trade routes, each retelling adding weight to the myth. One said Baba Yaga had walked through walls like smoke. Another said the Boogeyman had stood alone against an entire battalion, leaving no man breathing. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the belief that two men had become the weapons of vengeance, belief that they could succeed where armies had failed in the hearts of the oppressed. This belief was fire in the hearts of the Empire. This belief was poison. It spread into every barracks, every command room, every palace, and soon the Empire was fighting not only two men but its own crumbling faith in itself. Even among the Emperor's inner circle, silence began to grow heavy. Their ruler sat upon his throne, cloaked in power, yet his advisors saw the unease in his eyes. He asked for reports each day, demanding proof that the threat was exaggerated, yet the reports always came back the same. Another garrison lost, another world abandoned, another detachment banished. The galaxy had turned. The people, once chained by fear, now carried courage born from myth, and the Empire, once held together by fear, now carried doubt born from the same myth. The balance was shifting not through fleets or battles but through the unstoppable march of two men whose rage turned into legend, and whose legend turned into revolution. The Empire had always believed itself eternal. Its fleets stretched across the stars, its armies marched without question, its throne sat high. above all challengers. Yet now that throne trembled, for the emperor himself felt the shadow that had spread through his realm like a disease. He had killed 2 generals and thought it victory, but he had summoned Baba Yaga and the American Boogeyman, and their wrath was not a rebellion, it was a reckoning. The palace world glittered under endless lights, its skies filled with patrol ships, its streets guarded by legions. The emperor believed no force could breach his gates yet. The whispers grew closer each day. His soldiers spoke of footsteps in empty corridors. His officers found messages carved into steel. She was my wife. His advisors began to vanish one by one, until only silence answered his questions. Baba Yaga struck first, appearing as if the shadows themselves carried him into the very heart of the capital. The guards never saw him enter, yet they fell one after another, their weapons clattering to the marble floor, their bodies arranged in silence. His eyes, burned with grief, turned into fury, and his presence alone broke the courage of men trained to fight without fear. No wall, no army, no order could stop him. He was inevitability given from the American Boogeyman came with precision, not as myth, but as man. His steps echoed down the grand halls of the palace, every movement calculated, every strike clean. He left no survivors, no confusion. His message was clear and cold. You took her from me, and now I take everything from you. He moved like a hunter through prey, and the palace guards, though countless, were nothing more than obstacles to be removed. Together though apart, they carved through the empire's last defense. The palace shook with the weight of their wrath, and still they did not slow, for they were not fighting for victory, they were fighting for vengeance. Each corridor they cleared was not a battle, it was a sentence delivered by 2 executioners who would not rest until the empire itself lay in ruin. The emperor waited upon his throne, surrounded by golden banners, yet his hands trembled upon the arms of his seat, for he knew what approached. His legions had failed, his generals had fallen, his fleets were scattered, and now he would face the very men he had awakened. He called them monsters, he called them myths, yet as the throne room doors shattered open, he realized they were men, and that made them far more terrifying, because men could not be reasoned with when they carried the fire of grief in their hearts. Final silence fell, as the throne room filled with the weight of their presence. Baba Yaga, a shadow of vengeance, and the Boogeyman, a hunter of flesh, both standing side by side, united not by blood or nation, but by love stolen and wrath unending. The emperor tried to speak, but no words came, for he understood at last the truth. He had not killed 2 generals, he had summoned 2 nightmares, and no empire, no matter how vast, could survive their wrath. Galaxy beyond the throne waited in silence, then in fire, then in freedom, for the empire was broken, and the names of Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman would be remembered not as myths, but as legends carved into the very stars.